Hey everyone, my name is Erin Meyer. I'm the Sustainable Food Programs Coordinator at the University of California, Merced. We are here today for an AMA with Renata, and I am very excited about it. I think it's going to be really interesting and inspiring too. So I would like to go ahead and just introduce Guillermo, or have himself introduce himself as well. This is Guillermo Ortiz.
Hello, everyone. I am Guillermo Ortiz. I am the Sustainability and Diversity Educational Programs Manager in the Office of Sustainability here at UC Merced. I want to thank everybody for attending, and we're looking to a great discussion. So, Renata, thank you so much for joining us and giving up some time today to speak with us. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation to do it. Is this one of the creative pandemic ideas that you've had to try to keep people connected? Is that part of the impetus for these sessions?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's a good opportunity to have less formal panel discussions and more natural dialogue between folks who are interested in a particular topic and related to sustainability. And so it's ranged from everything to food to social justice and everything else in between. So yeah, I think it's a good time to just kind of get to talk to people that you might not necessarily have had the opportunity to do.
Great. And being virtual allows us to connect, across boundaries we might not have been able to before. So, well, it's a small enough group. I wonder if people would feel comfortable just speaking just for a minute. You don't have to take yourself off video if you don't want, but just sharing a little bit about what interested you in coming to this session, or what your thoughts are about policy in the ag space. That would just help me. I'll do a little bit of an introduction maybe to our work, but I can kind of tailor it to what people are interested in. So I'll just say just a little bit maybe about CalCAN, and then we could, if people are open to that, just kind of do a quick go around. So CalCAN stands for the California Climate and Agriculture Network, and we are a coalition of 7 sustainable and organic agriculture organizations that have been working in California. Almost all of them have been around for several decades. And they all focus on providing services to farmers. So it's everything from technical assistance to direct services. In the case, since the pandemic, some of them have helped with raising funds for relief efforts, outreach, and some of them do work on policy, both on the state level and the federal level, and on the Farm Bill, for example. So we came together 12 years ago to fill what we thought was a need at the time, which is to have agriculture and farmer representation in the climate policy space. In California, we've got a really ambitious set of programs, and actually quite a lot of money to incentivize activities that address climate change, that both reduce greenhouse gases and also help adapt to the impacts of climate change. So we've really got a lot, to work with there. But back then, a dozen years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of engagement from the agriculture sector. So we came together to provide that kind of expertise and influence on the way the policies and the programs and the funding started to roll out. We've been pretty successful in doing that. There are now 4 different programs that we work on, at least, that fund farmers to reduce emissions on their farms, in their operations, and to protect farmland from development, so that we don't get those increased emissions that come with urban development and with more driving. And so I can talk, a long time about the details of those, but I'll leave it there, and maybe we can just do a quick go around. I just, thinking about what is it about the climate ag policy space that you're all interested in, or what drew you to this topic. Is anybody willing to kick us off with that? Maybe like an introduction to who you are too. Johan, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Johan. I live in Boston, and the reason why I'm interested in this intersection between food systems, sustainability, agriculture, and policy is because Um, I'm very interested in agroforestry and any. I'm going to start my PhD in public policy in the fall, and one of the things I'm really interested in is how do you build food security while you also build food sustainability, and also I'm thinking about community engagement and how civic engagement might help implement certain practices that are more that might lead to better environmental um, benefits and just to create employment opportunities or just engage community and into a more democratized food system. So those are some of the things I think about.
Johan, that was great introduction. Thank you. Brings up a lot of thoughts for me. I'm making some notes to pick up on things as we go. Welcome, Mark. We're just, I just gave a little bit of a wrap about CalCAN, and I know Mark and he knows CalCAN, so he didn't miss anything yet. And now we're just kind of going around and people are offering what it is about the ag climate policy space that they're interested in.
Okay, thanks, Renata. I'm eating lunch, so I'll come back on camera later.
Okay, no worries.
Renata, so I first, after graduating from undergrad, the first like internship or real job experience I had was interning for Congressman Jim Costa of right here in the Central Valley. One of the things I worked on as an intern a lot was water policy here in California, is specifically how it affects the agricultural sector being the predominant use of water here in the state. And with climate change, looking to further stress water resources, not only here in the United States, but globally, I'm wondering what's the conversation about how to manage water resources in a way that doesn't really devolve into what some would call water wars, right? Essentially just very antagonistic relationship over water resources, whether we can focus that on a state level or a federal level. But it seems like these resources are being stressed, and it would be interesting to see how the stakeholders are responding to that stress and how it proceeds over time.
That's great. Thanks. There's a lot to say there too. You want to go next?
Yeah, hi Renata. So my name's Kaylee. I'm fairly recent in California. I just finished my master's degree last year in food systems and society. But really prior to that, I had studied environmental science and climate change. And my thesis was focused on how climate change will exacerbate social inequities, both for farmers and producers. And so I'm kind of entering the workforce at that intersection of how climate change is impacting social inequities, what are the policies to address that. And then really one of my interests directly from what you're doing, in addition to thinking about the career path possibilities, eventually I'd like to get, soak up as much knowledge I can out of California, but then eventually back in my home state, which is magically is the fastest growing agricultural state in the nation. As climate shifts, Alaska's rapidly growing. And so I'm really interested in the model of CalCAN, understanding how that initiative launched. There's nothing like that to support farmers in Alaska right now who are facing, massive shifts in climate. So there's a lot of farmers there and no systems yet to support them since it's a relatively new industry. So that's my thinking and what I'm interested in.
Great, thanks, Kaylee. Jolene, Jesus, Mark, or Aaron, do you want to chime in?
Yeah. So personally, I'm interested in food waste reduction, surplus food. And so immediately the biggest policy on my plate right now is dealing with SB 1383, which is a California piece of legislation that is going to soon, and pretty soon here, start impacting local businesses, the university in general, and other farms and such. So businesses of certain size are going to have to start either composting or donating edible food in an effort to keep food out of the landfill, because food going to the landfill can create methane, one of these greenhouse gases that we're speaking of. And so the idea behind SB 1383 is to keep that food out of the landfill and then onto people's plates to reduce climate change and also just better resource management and so on. So that's my area of interest, but I'm also a sustainable food advocate. So everything around that, including like opting for more plant-based diets to get some of the methane reductions there as well, is important to me. And all of the other aspects that go along with climate change. I'm an environmentalist the whole way through. So all of this is very interesting to me. Thank you.
Great. There's definitely an intersection with SB 1383 in our work. It's a little different than food waste. It's more about methane reduction on dairies, but we can touch on that too.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. That was one of my questions, but I'll just let you touch on it when we get started. And then Jolene, I can just say she's my intern. She's fantastic. So she's a Global Food Initiative fellow. So she's helping me work on one of our projects, the People's Fridge, where we get surplus food from the community into this outdoor fridge, this community fridge, take it or leave it kind of thing. So simultaneously reduces community food waste as well as food insecurity in our area. And so she's working on a project with me and some other interns, and she's fantastic. So feel free to jump in, Jolene, if you'd like. Otherwise, no worries.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. I'm also a third-year mechanical engineer at the UC Merced, and I would like to learn more about like agriculture, like on like this, like how to incorporate like sustainability, water management within the agricultural field, because there's a couple of engineer majors I know are also in the agricultural route, and like I would like to learn a lot more on how to like help with like not only like with sustainability in agricultural, it's just like how engineering helps incorporate with agriculture.
Great. Thanks, Jolene.
Yeah, and Jolene's organization just really generously donated these gardening boxes to our local community garden, like equipped with, I think, irrigation and all of that. So shout out to them, these young, ambitious, inspiring engineers and everyone else at the UC. So thank you, Jolene, for your hard work. All right, Renata, go for it.
Jump in. Okay, there's a lot to work with here. If anybody else wants to shoot out questions or comments as we go, that's great. Well, maybe I'll just say a little bit more about the CalCAN model and how it came about for Kaylee's benefit mainly. Well, it's interesting to everybody. I talked a little bit about how we started, which is as a coalition, which actually is really key, I think, to our ability to be as effectual as we are, because our reach is much greater because of the fact that we work in coalition. We work with these other organizations that all have memberships or connections within in the space and have been around for a while. So we weren't just kind of a startup in a way. And we continue to work and really depend on those kind of that web of relationships around the state. California is a pretty ambitious place to advance any kind of policy because it's such a huge economic engine. I'm sure you all know it's like the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. The legislature is just full on all the time. There's usually about 3,000 bills introduced in a given year. It's a year-round legislature, unlike some states that only meet for part of the year. Some states have like volunteer legislators. I mean, this is a full-time effort to be governing a state this large, and then of course we're a big ag state as well, so there's just a lot of complexity. So to influence all that requires this sort of vast network of relationships, because we alone are very, very small. We're just a 5-person organization. And so I think what really actually makes this possible in California to have made progress, and I'll touch a little bit on some of the things that, some of the more, in more detail, some of the things that have been put in place. What makes it possible is the context we're in. I mean, I would say that's really what makes all politics possible, is what time, your timing and your, the opportunities and the threats that you can anticipate, to move, policy, to affect systems change, to affect how resources flow and how, what regulations get put in place and so on. And so in California, we were formed soon after a very ambitious bill was passed under Governor Schwarzenegger, the Global Warming Solutions Act. That was in 2006. We came into being about 6 years later. Wait, is that right? No, 3 years later, as that bill was being implemented. So all of the pieces of that bill that basically said, established California's mandates around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, they were starting to come online. The programs were just starting to be designed. It's a really complex bill with a lot of tentacles into the economy. But there were no programs that addressed agriculture head on, that provided resources for farmers to do their part in reducing emissions. And so that was really, we saw an opportunity to be players in that dialogue, to bring the voices of farmers and to bring the expertise of their advocates and the people who provide them services and the educators into that dialogue, to that table in Sacramento, saying, look, we're here, we've got solutions, we need resources, to support us in doing new practices, but we definitely have some powerful solutions. So, and there was money. That was the other thing. There was the promise of money, at least, because we had a cap and trade program and still do. That is a source of a considerable amount of funding, $1 billion a year, plus or minus. And so our approach to this whole problem has been to direct some of that funding in the form of incentives, in the form of competitive grants to farmers, to incentivize them using practices that have a whole host of environmental benefits. So very, very quickly, well, I kind of want to go in a bunch of directions at once. Kaylee, I'll just bookmark for you the fact that though we've been working in California for a dozen years, we've also started a national network of organizations that are not quite as far along as California because it doesn't have that context. The other states don't have as ambitious climate policies, and they don't have sources of funding to the same extent we do. But nonetheless, there's a lot of organizations like us that are trying to figure out a way to advance, especially healthy soils policies. So we've got a sort of a loose network of 24 different states with farmer-centered organizations around the country that are working together to be a resource to one another about how to advance policy. So we're sort of this think tank, resource center for groups that want to try to learn from the California model, but not just California. We really learn a lot from each other. So that's just something that we could follow up with later. There's no Alaska member of our network. So just to touch on some of the main types of activities in agriculture that can have climate benefits. California has these very ambitious goals about reducing emissions. They're not ambitious from a scientific perspective. They're actually incredibly necessary. Scientists, have determined how many tons of greenhouse gases we have to reduce in order to keep our climate inhabitable. And so the goals that California has set are consistent with those that scientific imperative, but they're, from a human perspective, they're very ambitious because they require changes across the entire economy in the way we do everything in our built infrastructure. So agriculture has a really important role to play because not only can it reduce emissions, but it can importantly sequester carbon in soils and in the woody plants that are found on farms. So trees, hedgerows, anything that's got, woody tissue. Johan's interested in agroforestry, and so there's a connection there in terms of the science of how carbon can be stored in plants and in living systems. So there's a program that the state stood up 3 years ago called the Healthy Soils Program, and it gives grants to growers for doing a whole bunch of practices that would pull down carbon from the atmosphere and lock it into soil and into plant tissue. There's been about $42 million worth of grants that have gone out under that program so far. And it's very closely connected to a federal program that Mark is familiar with, because Mark used to be at USDA, that incentivizes farmers for environmental stewardship practices of all kinds. There's a subset of the practices in that federal program that are the same practices used here in California. So it's things like cover crops, compost, all kinds of conservation plantings, hedgerows and riparian corridors and buffer zones and all kinds of stuff. Prescribed grazing is another of the practices that are incentivized under that program. Mulch, reduced tillage. There's something like 25 or 6 practices that are currently eligible for funding under that program. And then there's another program that gives grants to farmers for conserving water. So it's called the SWEEP program. It's got a long name. The acronym is SWEEP, State Water Energy Enhancement Program. And that one basically gives grants to farmers for improved irrigation, more efficient irrigation, for solar panels, for soil moisture monitoring equipment, so growers can more precisely apply the water to where the plant needs it. So there's a little bit of a nexus there with Guillermo, with your interest in water policy. That's kind of that's the main place where we've intersected with state policy. State water policy is around getting that program stood up and continually funded. I think there's been, if I remember right, something like $70 million in grants that have gone into that program. Very popular with farmers who have been facing drought we just went through, it feels like we just finished our last historic drought, and it looks like we might be on the verge of our next one. So that program actually came into being during the last drought in 2015. I'll come back maybe to say just a little bit more about water policy in a minute. The third program that we've been working on and have been one of the more sort of vocal advocates for is something called the AMP program, Alternative Manure Management Program. And this is the one, Aaron, that relates to SB 1383. 1383 is a bill that passed a few years ago, I want to say in 2017, that set requirements for methane reductions. Methane is really potent greenhouse gas emission, greenhouse gas, and it comes from a number of sources, including compost facilities, or rather, sorry, not from compost facilities, from landfills. So waste diversion, organic waste diversion from landfills is one of the solutions that the state is looking into for meeting those methane reduction goals. And another source of methane, a very big one actually in California, is the dairy. Well, it's livestock generally, but primarily dairy. So this AMP program gives grants to farmers, dairy producers primarily, for converting their waste management systems from a slurry lagoon type, like a flush system, to a drier system, so that that organic waste is not anaerobically decomposing and off-gassing methane. So those grants actually yield not only methane reductions, but also this incredibly valuable source of fertility in the form of compost or aged manure. And that's also been a really popular program in California. And then the fourth program I wanted to touch on is the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program, SALC. you need to, if you don't already know, the world of government is full of long names and hard to remember acronyms. So that's the world we're in right now. So if you forget any of these, just ask me. SULC has been a very important tool for conserving farmland and minimizing urban development or urban sprawl. So the goal here is to avoid future emissions that come with when we develop our urban areas in an unsustainable manner, when we sprawl out onto this really incredibly fertile prime ag land. And that's happening at a very alarming rate. It has been for many years, where we lose an average of 50,000 acres a year here in California of this, some of the best ag land in the world, to development. So those grants are intended to permanently protect farmland and ranch land from development if they can prove, if the projects can prove that they would otherwise be at high risk of development. So the grants work in coordination with, or they support smart growth and infill development and discourage sprawl. So I'm going to pause there because that was just a lot of download before I try to pick up some of the other things that people mentioned. Does that raise any questions for anyone, or does anyone want to make any comments on any of that? Or Nina, and Nina, I guess, is the only person who joined. Nina, if you wanted to jump in and introduce yourself, we'd welcome that as well. Mark, you.
Yes, hello.
So let's go.
Oh, sorry, I'm joining late. My name is Nina. I share they pronouns. I'm calling in from Rhode Island and the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. We have a climate and agriculture and food systems working group. So calling in to listen in and learn and share back with my colleagues and fellow council members as well.
Great, thanks for joining, Nina. And Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Lipson. I'm currently pro bono staff affiliate with the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems at UC Santa Cruz, where I graduated in 1982. And I spent 5 years at USDA in the Obama administration as the Secretary, Office of the Secretary, Organic and Sustainable Agriculture Policy Advisor. Before that, Organic Farming Research Foundation Policy Director for 15 years, and employee #1 of California Certified Organic Farmers in 1985. And I'm here as geezer support for Renata. On behalf of my generation, I apologize because we burnt the planet. I'm coming to you from the CZU fire burn scar in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where our farm got heavily damaged in the lightning storm fires last August. So climate change and agriculture for us right now is survival and rethinking everything. And no idea where it will lead us. In the policy realm, you know, the stuff that Renata and I have been working on for a long time, you know, has borne some really great fruit. And, you know, the things CalCAN has done are prominent among those. But they're still nibbling around the edges. And so you guys have to, you know, figure out what the leapfrog is. I mean, California is not a model anymore because everything we've been building in California has just been a patchwork, you know, little niches around the edges. And you guys have to get to the heart of it. If people have questions about the like what's going on in DC, and the Biden administration and the ag committees. I can share, what I know about that. I'm, currently preoccupied with the fire recovery, but I am in touch, with my peers from my term of service who are staffing up USDA just like unbelievably greatly. I got, I'll leave on that. I'll stop on that note because it is phenomenally great. The appointments that, not counting the secretary necessarily, but from there on down, man, it's great.
Yeah, Mark is truly a resource for folks who want to get more into federal policy, but also the deep California history you have here, Mark. Appreciate all that work, and I also appreciate your sense of urgency that you just brought there at the end. I think that I'd love to chase that a little further before our time is over here. I also wanted to just throw out that if you're interested in federal policy, another really helpful resource is the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which has been at that work for 40 years, I think, working on farm bill policy and other federal policy. And they're trying to make a big push to make the most of this very probably small window of opportunity with the Biden administration and the narrow margins of control in Congress for pushing through some climate and progressive farm policy. So I'm encouraged, Mark, to hear that you're some of those lower level appointments are looking and hirings are looking good from your perspective. All of them, excellent. That's great.
Pretty much.
That's great. That's good. Yeah, there's a lot of work, a lot of cleanup to do, and a lot of pivoting really fast. That's going to be needed. Well, I don't see any more hands right now, so I kind of feel like I want to maybe try to weave a few things together. As Mark said, the work that CalCAN did, and I think the work that USDA is doing to incentivize all kinds of environmental practices on farms is certainly great. I mean, there's a lot has been done. A lot of money has moved into the hands of farmers over the years. But I'll say that last year's constellation of crises, at least here in California, have really quickened and quickened the work we were doing to try to become a more holistic, more intersectoral organizing entity. And this touches a little bit on something that Johan was interested in about community engagement and democratic participation, and maybe also a little bit about social inequities. Last year we saw the pandemic. We saw the incredible impact that it had on our food system. We had at the same time as we had people going hungry all over the place, and still do. We also had food in the beginning, at least, food going to waste because those really rigid, consolidated supply chains that we've built up that are sort of hyper specialized, they failed because we all of a sudden didn't have restaurants and institutions buying food, and we needed to get food into supermarkets and into individual households, and they're completely different supply chains. So we were seeing scarcity of things. Of course, with all of the economic hardships that the pandemic brought, we're also seeing the burden on food banks and hunger programs and senior nutrition programs just being taxed to the limit, overtaxed. We saw what an incredible impact the pandemic had on farm workers who many people don't understand how incredibly important they are to getting us fed. And I think that became more apparent to more people. They're always the ones that have the greatest burden of the systemic, historically systemic, problematic, racism based, systems. And the pandemic just elevated all that, just laid that all bare. So it was impossible to ignore anymore. And then we had wildfires being, just the wildfire crisis here in California is just incredibly intractable problem that comes from many decades of mismanagement. And then we had the racial, some would say awakening, crisis, the protests, the understanding that I think in many sectors of all of this civic work that we have all of our systems are rooted in racism, and we have a tremendous amount of work to do to address inequities. So in the food and farming system, that plays out in a lot of very specific ways, and I think that combination of crises just made it impossible to ignore some of those deep roots. So, so there's a great sense of urgency, and there's a great sense of opportunity, I would say, from an organizing point of view. What was impossible to imagine a year and a half ago, I think, is suddenly not only possible to imagine, but necessary. So one example of that is that at CalCAN, we'll continue our work to try to get the climate smart ag programs that I mentioned earlier, to try to get them funded, and keep the momentum going for them. There's a lot of farmer interest, and a lot more than there is money to fund. But we're also now working in coalition with a number of other organizations across up and down the food supply chain, including farm worker advocacy groups, anti-hunger groups, and groups that work on food systems, trying to get a bond passed that would fund investments all up and down the food system, to address some of these inequities and to address some of the sort of structural brokenness of our food system, as well as to incentivize practices that have climate benefits and other environmental benefits. And equity is at the center of that work, where the bill, or the author of the bill is Assemblymember Robert Rivas, and he's deeply dedicated to farm worker well-being and sustainable agriculture. And 40% of the $3 billion that is proposed in that bond measure would be earmarked for communities, for people of color, for socially disadvantaged communities. It's a term of the state. It basically is an economic indicator. And it would prioritize throughout all of the investments. It would prioritize and set aside pots of money that would be explicitly for farmers of color, for example, and when it comes to sustainable agriculture practices, or for communities that are especially vulnerable to hunger and some of the other chapters of the bill. So it's a really new organizing model for us to be stepping outside of what had been very sort of specifically focused on farm practices. We're now working closely with these other advocates in the food system space. So it's an ambitious campaign, and it's got there's a lot of work ahead. But the bond, if it passes in the November 2022 ballot measure, would start funding some of those investments as early as the year 2023. And I think I want to loop in a little bit on wildfires here too. Doesn't directly connect with the bond, although some of the practices that would be funded in that bond and that are funded by the Healthy Soils Program especially do have the ability to help us mitigate the dangers of wildfire, especially when it comes to prescribed grazing, for example, or cultural burning practices. These are two different strategies that can be used on land to try to minimize or avoid catastrophic wildfires. It's that interface that agriculture often plays between, or that buffer agriculture often has between urban areas and wilder open spaces. That's a part that's the type of land that we can apply some deliberate practices to, that can help prevent the kinds of widespread fires that we've been seeing these last few years, as well as help those areas recover from damage from wildfires by bringing animals on and reintroducing fertility into those soils. So there are a few bills that are making their way through the legislature right now that we're engaged with, that to try to strike that balance between commercial agricultural production and environmental benefits. Let me pause again on that one and see if that was another whole new set of ideas. So let me just see if there's any comments or thoughts about any of that. I also see we were joined by Grelly or Marcy. Marcy, if you want to introduce yourself at any point, feel free to jump in.
Hello. Yeah, I'm a student at the UC. I work for Erin Mayer and her team for the sustainability department, and we focus on food waste. So it's been really interesting to learn about this. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mark, were you going to jump in there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't completely grokked everything about the initiative. What are the next big steps? What are the big milestones coming up on that?
On that one. So the bill, it's called AB 125, Assembly Bill 125. It was just introduced, meaning, the language was made available publicly about 3 weeks ago, I believe, 3 weeks ago. So the legislative process is that any bill that's introduced has to go through at least one policy committee, sometimes two. And in this case, it'll be heard in the Agriculture Committee in the Assembly on the 15th of April, which is coming right up. And then it'll soon thereafter be heard in the Natural Resources Committee on probably the 28th of April. If it passes through those two committees, then it'll go into a bit of a holding pattern called the Appropriations Committee. This is where a lot of bills go if they cost anything, which this one, of course, does. It's a bond measure, which means that there's a debt, that would come with it. There'd be it's essentially a loan that the government would take to make these really important investments. So it goes into the Appropriations Committee, and it could take a while for the negotiations to get it out of that committee to take place. It gets a little harder to predict the future at that point. But if it can get out of the Appropriations Committee, it goes to a full vote of the Assembly, and then it goes over to the Senate at the state level and goes through the same process, the same deliberative process through the rest of the calendar year, or possibly into next year. This is a 2-year bill, so it could be that it takes, it sort of gets paused at some point in the process this year and then gets picked back up again next year. It's a very complex bill, and it's a very ambitious bill, and it also is. There are several other similar bond measures that are being proposed for the 2022 ballot. So there's going to need to be some conversation between some of those various authors to figure out the best package to move forward with. The state of California, though it looks like we have a lot of money right now, there's a lot of concern about economic hard times ahead. So there's a reluctance to fund this. Well, there's not only a reluctance to fund this kind of infrastructure, but there's also it's challenging to do that just with a general fund, just with typical tax revenues. So the bond is one answer to that. And California has had has a track record of issuing bonds in order to pay for those kinds of big infrastructure investments. There's never been a bond measure, though, dealing with the food system. The last few bond measures have dealt with water infrastructure, with dam building and water delivery, for example. They tend to fund things like roads and, major sort of urban industrial infrastructure. This is a really different approach. This is both green infrastructure in the agriculture space and also food distribution, food hubs, school food infrastructure, so that we can make sure our kids are eating healthy, food processing facilities, cold storage, farm worker housing, so that farm workers have safe and affordable housing instead of the overcrowded conditions that they live in now. And then a lot of investments in the sort of climate smart agriculture programs that I described earlier, a lot of which are hard costs, capital improvements to these farms to make sure that they can continue to operate into the 21st century. So it's a big infrastructure bill. So the next steps, Mark, are to try to get it to try to demonstrate a lot of power, a lot of interest in these investments, and make sure that we have a place at the table when it comes to the conversation.
So are you going to describe your how would you encapsulate the political and grassroots strategy for exerting that power to this group of youngsters here?
Yeah.
One paragraph.
One paragraph. Yeah. Well, we got to get a lot of sign-on letters. We got to get a lot of organizations from a lot of sectors in the food system to say, yes, this is important. Yes, we should get this bond measure on the ballot. So that's everything from food banks to nonprofit organizations to advocates that have to say to their elected representatives, this is a top priority. They have to do that in writing. They have to do that with calls. We had a lobby week a couple weeks ago where we had 100 people come and virtually and meet with their legislators on Zoom and deliver that message.
Okay, what's your take on organizing in the post-COVID age? I mean, things are completely freaking different.
Yeah, no.
And I want to ask these other people, what do they think? And what is organized? Is it TikTok? Is it something else that Renata and I probably haven't even heard of? Because it's your generation that has to be the activist power, not us.
Has anybody engaged in any kind of
if you tell me it's TikTok, I'm gonna go cry.
Well, it's not TikTok, is what I'll say. I mean, I feel like with a lot of organizing, like we saw with Black Lives Matter, it was a mix of things. It was everything from Facebook to Twitter to TikTok to folks just like going around talking to friends. Like, I mean, the degree to which advocacy has changed now is pretty remarkable, which is also very odd because those very same tools are being used very much to suppress advocacy in different parts of the world. So I think there's a concern and risk there about organizing using social media tools, but they are effective. So I think that is a balance that a lot of advocates are going to have to contend with. But I do think in general, what we saw from COVID is just people being tired of a status quo that doesn't really work for them, and a general disbelief or distrust in authority. So I'm not surprised that I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more advocacy efforts in a post-COVID world where people are more accustomed to organizing and sharing their opinions on topics, especially on the topic of climate change. It just becomes more and more real. I remember reading an article recently. It was Japan just marked like one of the earliest blossoming of their cherry blossoms in 1,200 years, and which one impressive record taking for on the blossoming of cherry blossom trees, but two, it's showing that there's a lot of canaries in the coal mine, and I think that's one of them that we've been watching, is that we're going to be hit with these realities. And so the propensity to then want to advocate is important. Yeah, exactly.
So what's your advice to Renata, or others of you, please? What's your advice to Renata about mobilizing now around, the very mundane, but, essential fundamentals? It's like your basic dribble exercise of, just showing up for these committee hearings, writing the letters, or sending the emails, not form letters, but like, so anyway, we need you guys' advice, not necessarily right now, but that's your assignment from me.
Yeah, I mean, I was a former congressional staffer. I worked in the U.S. Senate, and so if chances are, if you wrote a letter to your New Jersey state senator, I was the one responding back, and so I would say, yeah, just in terms of like the inner workings of a congressional office and how that all works with letters coming in, I would say aggregate data is usually helpful in telling like what campaigns are going, but we have data and tools to determine, right, if you signed up to a petition and we're getting 5,000 letters and they all say the same thing with just a new name, like we essentially, like to us, that's one letter, right? Versus if you like, you're going to get a more personalized response from at least from our staff if it's a personally written letter, because you honestly can't write a form letter back because it'll be too specific. But I think one of the general pieces I have for advice from my time in DC was that policy tends to work in silos, and so this intersection and this coalition working on climate change, I think we've heard different groups already mentioned, but it should include agricultural workers. It should include faith-based organizations. It should include housing advocates. It should include environmental advocates, as we know, food advocates as well. There's we got to go find the few folks in Wall Street who understand that it's bad for business and get them on the same coalition. But I think tearing down traditional silos and building broad-based coalitions is one of the more effective ways, and has been a factor in a lot of successful movements. It's just getting more people than your traditional, what would you traditionally expect to see? I'm sure I'm sure many members of Congress are used to their environmental groups. I don't think they're used to having their housing organizations, environmental groups, and then banks come into the same meeting and advocate for the same thing. I think that's a different level of power.
What about the rest of you guys? Anybody else got a insight into how Renata's campaign, taps your network, your energy?
I have a couple of ideas. I mean, like I lived in a city where most people are immigrants from Central America. So WhatsApp is a very effective way to communicate among immigrants. And then the other thing related to the breaking those silos or bridging building those bridges between different disciplines. I think food policy councils are such a great place to bring everybody together. So I'm part of a food policy council here in Salem, Massachusetts, and we have people who are part of the food banks, also people working for the city. I work in academia, so just I bring a different perspective and I help with writing grants. So I think, yeah, I think that's a great place to I guess it also depends on how the Food Policy Council works, but I think it's a great place for people to bring their own set of skills and expertise and knowledge just to try to tackle different problems. And yeah, I think those are the two things I can think of at this point.
I just wanted to briefly add, here in Rhode Island, our Rhode Island Food Policy Council is part of something called the Renew New England Alliance. I'm just going to drop a quick link in the chat. I know our coasts are doing very different things, but also lots of parallels. And this alliance brings together like 150 plus grassroots organizations from across the region, from across the 6 states, and each state has their own coalition. And I think what's worked really well in our Rhode Island coalition is that all the states are putting in similar legislation across the states. And then the coalitions are a real mix of organizations, labor groups, environmental justice groups, food groups, but all really with the focus that they're grassroots and BIPOC and frontline community-led organizations. And there's a range of theories of change within the organizations in that groups like the Rhode Island Food Policy Council are part of this, but also groups, and in my non-food policy council time, I wear a Sunrise hat, and groups like Sunrise are doing a lot of real political agitating that includes things like direct actions and really saying to legislators, if you don't get on board with this, we're going to show up and testify virtually for these bills, but we're also going to primary you in 2022 if you don't get on board. So I think some of that balance of more traditional advocacy and coalition building roots, and also I think like this younger generation, I'm 23, like people are fed up, and rightfully so, with a lot of the systems that have failed marginalized communities again and again and again. So I think there's a lot of energy and power behind not just working within kind of the lines of the system, but really putting pressure on that system to say, we're going to take over that system if you don't start working for us.
Well said. I think ending on these notes would be inspirational and good action items. I wanted to go ahead and thank everyone involved for your great questions, and then all the input in general, and Renata for being here. Thank you so much. This recording will be posted on YouTube and sent out via email to everyone that both registered and attended. So look for that hopefully later today. And then if anyone else wants to say any last words, feel free.
I just want to say, thank you for the great discussion and the advice. And I think there's going to be a lot of work to do. So I'm glad for your expertise and your wisdom and guidance. And I hope for the folks who are on the call who are doing the work as well, that they take that to heart and implement it within their own work. So thank you.
When did Renata know she was a badass, and how does she keep it going? We need the answer to that question. Come on.
I think I'll defer for now. I'd rather keep the focus on the group, but I appreciate the question. And who the heck Tracy is, I want to know. I want to know that too. Which Tracy? I know a lot of Tracys.
Oh, I'll email you probably. I don't want to put her last name in that or anything. I didn't want to expose anyone.
You didn't want to out her.
Yeah, exactly. But it's for no.
I can guess 3.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for the invitation. I appreciate the level of engagement. Sometimes you come to these Zoom calls and you just end up just talking at a lot of blank screens. So really appreciate that level of conversation. It's hard to achieve in a short time, especially bringing people together from lots of different perspectives. But I thought that was a really rich exchange. So thanks for inviting me too, Erin.
Of course. Thank you for joining. Definitely very rich. But thank you all for attending, and I look forward to future AMAs. Feel free and let us know if you have any particular guests you would like to see at the next AMA. All right. Thank you all.